Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight at the Lewiston Public Library for a presentation with the First Amendment Museum.
Hello, everybody. Hello in person, and hello to everyone on Zoom. So today we're talking about the First Amendment, 21st Century Edition. We're going to be hitting a lot of stuff really hard, really fast. So if anybody has any questions while I'm talking, just submit them while I'm talking. No need to wait till the end. It makes it a little more interesting for me, keeps the energy alive. My name is Maxwell Nosbisch. I'm the manager of visitor experiences at the First Amendment Museum, just right over in Augusta, so not too far away. What is the First Amendment Museum? That's a great question. A lot of people have never heard of us, and that's one thing we're trying to do is get our message out there and get who we are out there. We're obviously located in Augusta, right next to the main governor's mansion in, right on State Street there, next to the Blaine House. Our mission is the First Amendment Museum inspires us, US, to live our freedoms by understanding and using our First Amendment rights to advance democracy so that all reap the benefits. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit, so we rely on generous donations, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and we're in the process of remodeling right now. This is a really nice picture of us, but right now we're under construction. So it doesn't look as nice as it does in this photo. We are located in a beautiful historical 1911 home. So that's pretty cool. And I just will plug that we're open for tours Monday through Saturday during the summer from 10 to 4 o'clock. So that's a little bit about us. And before we talk about now, since we are talking about the First Amendment 21st Century Edition, I think we do have to talk a little bit about the then, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The basics that I think everyone needs to know, and hopefully everyone does, if you attended civics class, elementary school or middle school, hopefully you know this already. The Constitution. When I talk about the First Amendment with students, I say, civics class and social studies, it's a lot of really big, complex words for very simple concepts. And how I explain to the students is the Constitution is a fancy word just for the laws of our government. That's all the Constitution is. It's the rule book for the government. It's the rule book for the country. Everybody's got rules. Even the government's got rules. So that's what the Constitution is, the laws of our country, of our government, especially the federal government. Every state has a constitution as well. Maine has a constitution. There's a national constitution. That's what we're talking about today. That's where we find the First Amendment. An amendment is just a fancy word for a change or an addition to the Constitution. So right now we have 27 amendments, of which we're talking about the first. Most people can name maybe 2 or 3, maybe 3 or 4. Even I struggle with a lot of them. A lot of them aren't the most exciting, but we do sort of remember a lot of the more exciting ones. And the Bill of Rights, for those who don't know, are the first 10 amendments. And we're going to be talking maybe about the author of the Bill of Rights, James Madison. Our 4th president, founding father from Virginia, he wrote the Bill of Rights. And again, that's the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights are some of the more famous amendments, and the First Amendment being the first of the Bill of Rights. So pretty simple stuff. The constitutions, the laws, the rules of our government. An amendment is a change or an addition to the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments written by James Madison. In order to get the Constitution passed, a lot of people wanted a Bill of Rights to ensure that there were certain things that the government would not restrict. If you pay attention to the first 5 words of the First Amendment, which we're going to see in a second, it's explicitly telling Congress, it's telling the government not to do something. So let's take a look at that text of the First Amendment. It's only 45 words. I like to say it's a 45-word run-on sentence, which it is. But it does tell a pretty interesting story, which we're going to break down. And as far as global constitutions and rules of law go, it's very short. If you look at a lot of other countries, they might have whole paragraphs devoted to the 5 freedoms found in the First Amendment. But we have all 5 of these freedoms protected. And again, one very long 45-word run-on sentence. So take a look. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I can't even say it right. I've said it a million times. So pretty short, pretty sweet. Bada bing, bada boom, 5 freedoms. Let's take a closer look. What does any of that mean? A lot of people sort of zone out when you start reading that 230-year-old text. I don't blame them. You know, it's not meant to be the most exciting document. I sometimes joke that if you need help falling asleep, just pull up a draft of the Constitution, try to read it like a novel. You'll be out in no time. I see when I do my school groups, I see their eyes glaze over as I read the First Amendment, or I have one of them read it to me. So let's break it down in simplest terms. It's protecting three things, 5 things from the government. So the first one is freedom of religion. Second is freedom of speech. The third is freedom of the press. Fourth is freedom of assembly. The last is freedom of petition. And where can we find it? I always like to remind everyone to bring it back around. We can find it in the Constitution. Again, the laws, the rules of our government. So you notice, again, like I said, the first 5 words, Congress shall make no law. So it's saying Congress, you cannot restrict these 5 freedoms. People in the United States, if you're an American citizen, you have these 5 freedoms because of the First Amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition and government. You cannot restrict those 5 things. You got to take away those 5 things. And look at the story it tells. It tells a very interesting story. There's a method to this madness. A lot of people think, oh, it's an order of importance. So, you know, it's not an order of importance. Freedom of speech isn't the most important one, like a lot of people think. In fact, freedom of speech is the most popular freedom in this First Amendment. About 70% of Americans can remember freedom of speech as being part of the First Amendment, and that's the highest remembered freedom, but they're all equally important and they all work together. And here's how they work together. So in the red, you'll see the first 16 words right before a semicolon. That's freedom of religion. You'll see Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Why did they put freedom of religion first? Shouldn't it be freedom of speech? Isn't freedom of speech the important one? Isn't that the one that everyone loves and, you know, we all need? Well, what is the value of having the freedom to speak if you don't have the freedom to think? And that's what freedom of religion is all about. Freedom of religion protects what's going on inside of you. With having the freedom of religion means you have the freedom to think, to philosophize, to moralize, to discern what is your purpose here? What is your pursuit of happiness? What is your relation with your fellow people, like with the government? How do you view what happens after you die? All of these great questions that influence your life, influence your sense of morality, your philosophy for the greater good. So you got to have freedom of religion to have freedom of thought. In fact, a lot of the founding fathers, when they were talking about the Constitution, they were referring to this as the freedom of conscience, which kind of gives you an insight onto what they were thinking. The Committee of Style for the Constitution changed it to freedom of religion at the last second. So kind of gives you an insight into what they're sort of thinking with that one. So now that you have the freedom to think, you want to have the freedom to do what? You want to have the freedom to tell those thoughts to others. So that's where the freedom of speech comes in, or abridging the freedom of speech. I now have the freedom to think. I now have the freedom to tell you my thoughts. We'll talk about some examples of speech, hopefully later on. Now that I've talked, I can tell my thoughts to others. I want to get my thoughts out there to a mass audience, or I want to write them down. I want to publish them. I want to put them online, whatever. There you have the shortest freedom in the First Amendment, or of the press. Freedom of the press, very important. But again, it's only 4 words in the First Amendment. Compare that to freedom of religion, which is 16 words. So it's interesting to break it down like this. But again, getting freedom of the press is getting your thoughts out there to the wider world. And now that your thoughts have gone out there to the wider world, people need to have the freedom to talk about your thoughts, to have a protest, have a rally, a parade, a march, form a union, form a political party, go get coffee, have an argument on Thanksgiving. We got to protect that. Or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Notice my picture of this rally. I'll move that picture again. And notice how this is the only one with a little bit of a caveat. It says peaceably. It's the only one with a little bit of a disclaimer. Kind of makes it interesting textually. It's the only one with a little bit of a warning. So, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble. And again, now that your thoughts have gotten out there to the wider public, people need to have the freedom to get together, do all those things, to interact with your thoughts in the public sphere. And now that they've done that, we want to finally let the government know our thoughts and to petition the government for redress of grievances. That's finally letting the government know your thoughts. What's protected under freedom of petition? A lot of things. It's going to your town council meeting. It's going to your school board meeting. It's hiring a lobbyist. It's writing a letter and email to your representative. It's not just signing literal petitions like we think of it when we hear the name. It's a lot more than that. So boom, 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 boom. Using those 5 steps, you turned your thought into tangible political action. And that's why the First Amendment's in that order. It's protecting that whole process. It's not an order of importance. You got to have all 5 to make it work. So they're all of equal importance. Let's take a closer look. So we're going to take a look at freedom of speech. We don't have time to talk so in depth about all of them today. We'll hit some of the highlights with some of them. So freedom of speech. What counts as speech? It's a good question. When I ask people, what is speech? What is that? When we say freedom of speech, what does that mean? They usually think, oh, well, it means you can go up on the stairs at the Lincoln Memorial and give a speech to 100,000 people. That's part of it. It is audible sounds coming out of my mouth like I'm doing now, but it's a lot more than that. It's giving a lecture like I'm doing right now. It's writing. It's making art. It's burning a flag. That's a pretty controversial one. Burning a flag, this little concept, we have symbolic speech. So what? You don't even need words to have it count as speech. It can be symbolic, or like we said, art. Music. Music's a form of speech. Again, even if you're listening to your favorite polka track and they don't have any words and you're just jamming out to the accordion, is that speech? Yeah, that's speech too. Making a sign. Maybe if you've gone to a protest, maybe you put one in your front lawn, side of the road, whatever you want to do. Hide, if you want to hold it on the sidewalk, like you see a lot of people do. Texting, the internet. Sign language. Theater. Theater's a form of speech. Movies too. You go down to Portland and you see the weird performers on the sidewalk and they've got their hat out and you can drop $1 in, you can drop a couple quarters in. That's their freedom of speech to do that. They can do that on the sidewalk. Those people, that's freedom of speech. Dance. Dance is a form of speech. Tattoos. Tattoos are a form of speech. And a big one that I don't have on here is clothing. Clothing is a form of speech. If you want to walk around with an inappropriate t-shirt out in the public, you're allowed to do that. I mean, you may lose a couple friends. People may not like you. People might call you obnoxious, but it's your right to do that. Government can't stop you. So those are all forms of speech. What do all those things have in common? They all convey an idea. Again, don't confuse freedom of speech with just the freedom to talk, because it's not just that. Freedom of speech is the freedom to communicate ideas in any way. So it's a lot of things. It's a lot more than just talking. So let's talk about some things that exist, that don't exist, that some people think do. And I hope I don't offend anybody with this, but unicorns, I think we can all agree, don't exist. Again, feel free to disagree. Mermaids don't exist. Centaurs, any fantasy fans, these things don't exist, unfortunately. But what also doesn't exist is free speech on social media. This is kind of shocking. What the heck? I thought I had free speech. I thought I had the First Amendment to protect me. So why don't I have free speech on social media? Bigger question, why did Donald Trump get kicked off Twitter? Wasn't that a violation of the First Amendment? Was that his freedom of speech to be on Twitter? Let's break that down. You might be crying again at home, going, what about the First Amendment? What about it? Doesn't it protect me? Doesn't it protect me from Twitter and Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, whatever? Let's take a look at the first 5 words of the First Amendment. Again, the key to understanding the First Amendment. I mean, it's such a good run-on sentence. It's a run-on sentence, but such a good run-on sentence because all the words are so parsed out and perfect, and you can tell thought went into this. So the first 5 words, Congress shall make no law. So again, the First Amendment's talking to you, government. It's saying you cannot make a law. And through the 14th Amendment, which got added after the Civil War, it got applied to the states. So the state governments can't make a law. And then, through subsequent Supreme Court cases, it got protected, beefed up by, protection against the state, and also protect against your local government. Your local government can't shut you down. So that's who the First Amendment protects you from. Keyword government. It protects you from the government. So when Donald Trump got kicked off Twitter, was that a violation of the First Amendment? No, because Twitter's not the government. Twitter's a private company. So if you get kicked off, if you violate the terms of service on social media and they kick you off, that's not a violation of the First Amendment. You might argue that it's a violation of your freedom of speech because freedom of speech is a larger, more theoretical, philosophical, cultural concept. But the legal question, the very narrow legal question of does the First Amendment protect me from social media companies? That's just no. But this thing called cancel culture, I think we're going to talk about it a little more, so we'll hold off on that. So again, I always like to drive this home because this is one of the biggest things that I really like to mention to people because so many people have this confused. So many people have this misconception that the First Amendment protects them on social media. So are any of these Congress? Facebook, is that Congress? No. I guess it's called Meta now. They try to fool us, change their name. No. Twitter's not Congress. Instagram is not Congress. TikTok, it's not Congress. TikTok's the Chinese government, not the United States government. Snapchat, it's not Congress. No, they're all private companies, so they can do what they want with their platform. I like to basically sum it up this way. If I go to Taco Bell right after this presentation and I want my Doritos Locos Nachos and I get it and it's cold, I'm mad about that. I just paid $8 for this whole meal, and I go and I start screaming at the employees. I start cursing at them. Is that my freedom of speech? No, Taco Bell can call the police and have me removed because they're a private company. So take that same principle and put it online, put it on social media. It's the same principle. This is a cool piece of art I found. It has a bunch of different social media companies' terms of service, and it's laid out by length. So you see Instagram in the sort of purplish, I guess, right there on the far right. It's really long. It goes all the way up to the left. So nobody reads that when you join social media. Nobody reads it. But if you violate it, they'll kick you off. And of course, they're always changing it as well. So if you violate, kick you off. So when Donald Trump got kicked off Twitter, was that a violation of the First Amendment? No, wasn't a violation of the First Amendment. But again, it brings up a lot of other questions that I think are interesting. Again, these philosophical, cultural questions are, what is free speech? What does free speech look like? Do social media companies have too much power over our society? Are social media companies such an important tool for communication, for free speech, that we should have the government come in and regulate them? Do certain people have too much power over social media? Does Mark Zuckerberg have too much concentrated power over Meta? You know, there's a lot of freak out over Elon Musk joining Twitter, or not joining Twitter, but taking over Twitter. Why are people afraid of that? Is it because Elon Musk will have a lot of influence over this very important method of communication? Well, how do we resolve this? You know, what do we do when we find a tweet someone wrote 10 years ago, wrote 20 years ago, that's being dragged up online? Do we punish that person? How do we punish them? Do we forgive them? What do we do? There's a lot of other questions that this sort of concept brings up, but will the First Amendment protect me is not one of them. But sometimes the government does intervene. Here's a little Supreme Court case from 2017 called Packingham versus North Carolina. I believe this is the first Supreme Court case dealing with social media. And so the state of North Carolina, they made a law where they said sex offenders weren't allowed on social media. If you were a sex offender, you cannot join social media. Someone sued, so that's a violation of the First Amendment. Social media companies are allowed to pick their own rules about who's online, who's using their sites, but the government can't do that. So it went all the way to the courts, and the courts actually sided against the state of North Carolina. They said, North Carolina, you making a law that bans sex offenders from being on social media, that's against the First Amendment. It's these social media companies, it's their right to pick and choose their people on their platform. If they want to make a platform, a rule in their terms of service against sex offenders, they're allowed to do that, but the government cannot. So pretty unpopular decision. You know, when I talk about this decision, it's a very interesting one, and it doesn't get a great reaction. It doesn't get universal praise. And I always this is a great reminder that there's a price we pay for all 5 of these freedoms. There's a price for all of them. Stuff like this. So that kind of brings up this question, which I've been beating around the bush, talking about cancel culture. Cancel culture, I hope everyone knows what it is. It's incredibly hard to define for people that don't know, but it's incredibly important. It's something in the zeitgeist. It's something that everyone's talking about these days is cancel culture. Oh, they're canceling this person. They're canceling that. They're canceling him. They're canceling her. They're canceling everyone. So these are a bunch of people who have been quote unquote canceled. And again, cancel culture brings up a lot of interesting philosophical, theoretical, cultural questions that relate to a lot of the freedoms in the First Amendment. Again, I've already mentioned a lot of them. You know, what should free speech look like? What should be the consequences for having an unpopular opinion? What should be the consequences of having an opinion that we loathe as a society, that everyone, pretty much 90%, 95% of people agree that's a terrible opinion? What should be the consequences for the 5% of people who say that? Again, what happens when we dig up something? Kevin Hart, he's up here. We found some tweets he made a couple years ago that were inappropriate. They got dragged up. And so what do we do to someone who may have changed their mind, whose cultural, societal standards may have changed over time? I remember even when I was in high school, which wasn't too long ago, I graduated high school in 2014. There were people saying things pretty openly, pretty frequently that you would never say today. That's only how many years ago? So things change fast. What do we do with these people who can't keep up? There's all sorts of questions that cancel culture raises. All these people are interesting stories and bring up all sorts of questions. And how do we deal with them? What do we do? And I will say that here's a little First Amendment lesson for you on misinformation, a little disinformation. I accidentally added Zooey Deschanel to this cancel culture wall of shame. Zooey Deschanel was never canceled. I meant to put Ellie Kemper from The Office, if anybody's seen that show. So little lesson right there, a little misinformation lesson. I kind of fubbed that one. What about hate speech? You hear this talked about a lot. What about hate speech? How do we, what if they're doing hate speech? What if you commit a hate speech? How do we deal with hate speech? Why don't we send these people to prison? Why don't we do, hate speech is a big problem. So hate speech is essentially defined as racism, sexism, homophobiaism, bigotry against religious groups, bigotry against ethnic groups. We all know what hate speech is. It's all of those things. And here's the long and short of it again. Here's the answer that probably pleases nobody with hate speech regarding legally the First Amendment is, in the United States, we don't have a legal concept of hate speech. You can't sue someone for hate speech. You can't send someone to prison for hate speech. You can't fine someone for hate speech. Hate speech doesn't exist as a legal concept in the United States. So you're never going to find a lawsuit about hate speech. The United States takes a very laissez-faire approach to speech. We basically believe in this thing called the marketplace of ideas. And the marketplace of ideas is essentially taking the principles of capitalism and applying it to speech. So we believe that much like a product, the best ideas will naturally rise to the top and the worst ideas will naturally fall to the bottom. And they'll sift themselves out through public discourse, through debate, through open discussion, all of those things, the press, that sort of thing. And we can ask if we believe that, right? I mean, do we all believe that the best ideas always rise to the top and the worst fall to the bottom? Does that hold true all the time? Is that really something to put your faith in, this sort of conceptual philosophical concept? It's an interesting, but that's sort of how our approach has been. And because of this marketplace of ideas approach, the government doesn't try to legislate hate speech. We don't try to rule on hate speech. And if you do a sort of mental exercise with yourself of trying to define hate speech or how you would legislate it, you'll see kind of why the government has taken a step back from it. I think, taking an example that I think is interesting is the musical, The Book of Mormon. If you're not familiar with the Book of Mormon musical, it's written by the people who make South Park. And if you've ever seen South Park, it's a very irreverent, offensive show. Probably a lot of hate speech in South Park, but it's written by those people. So the Book of Mormon, it makes fun of Mormons. And if we passed hate speech laws, would that be hate speech? Would you be able to write something like the Book of Mormon? Or would you ban that? Would they not be allowed? Or how do you draw the line between hate speech? Who gets to decide what's hate speech and what's not? Who gets to decide who gets targeted by hate speech? These are all questions that, again, depend on person to person that everyone can make compelling arguments for. And it's why essentially the courts and our legislators have taken a step back and not tried to legislate hate speech. But that doesn't mean others haven't tried. In Western Europe and in Asia, a lot of countries have tried to legislate hate speech. Hate speech is illegal in Britain, France, Germany, the Nordic countries, Japan. Japan just passed a law that you can't threaten anyone on social media. If you threaten someone on social media, you'll spend a year in prison or you'll get fined. That's what Japan's doing. But again, what constitutes a threat? What constitutes the threat? That's the question the Americans are asking. What constitutes the threat? So you get a lot of interesting, we can talk all day about the efficacy of these Western European and Asian, South Korean, Japan, Australia, these laws, how effective they are. And, they lead to all sorts of interesting things and outcomes. But, they're trying a different approach. They're saying, hate speech is such a problem that we're trying to legislate it away. We're trying to legislate against, at least suppress it a little bit, right? We all agree it's universal bad. 95% of people say it's bad. So why not just legislate against it? We've taken a different approach here in the United States. So let's shift gears a little bit to freedom of the press. We've obviously gotten in some interesting territory regarding freedom of the press in the United States in the 21st century. I don't think anybody could deny that. I like to say, my personal opinion is that freedom of the press is the most controversial freedom in the First Amendment. I think this one really gets people going. When I give my tour at the First Amendment Museum, which everyone should come and visit, usually people have a lot to say about freedom of the press. So freedom of the press, I always ask everyone, how do you get your news? How do you get your news? You go to the newspaper, you go to YouTube, you go to podcasts, you get on social media, talk to your friends. How do you get your news? And who do you trust and why? How do you verify them? Do you verify them? Who do you trust? How do you get your news? So even trying to define the press in 2022 is a sort of exercise in futility. I mean, people with PhDs can't define the press for you anymore. It was a lot easier when the First Amendment was written to define what the press is. Now it's morphed into a lot of things. So we know it's newspapers. That's what everyone's mind goes to, is newspapers. This dying medium, unfortunately, for better or for worse, dying, shrinking in influence, newspapers. That's what everyone thinks of. That's the classic press. What about what we see on TV? We all know that's the press. Turn on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, wherever you're getting your news, you see the talking heads on TV. The radio. It's all one that's pretty easy to forget, but already you're getting into like weird territory, right? Again, you think the press is just newspapers, but what about spoken word over the radio? What if you turn on the radio in the morning, the press? Again, that's the concept the founding fathers didn't have around. Technology the founding fathers didn't have around. Online articles. So that's how our newspapers are saving themselves, through online articles, Portland Press Herald. But what about things like podcasts? A lot of people get their news from podcasts. You may listen to a political, a society, a cultural podcast. You may listen to a history podcast. All sorts of podcasts. Is that the press? What about social media? Am I a reporter if I see a crime happen here in Lewiston and I go on Facebook and give my account of the crime and I write a whole multi-paragraph summation of what happened? Am I now a member? Am I a reporter? Am I a journalist? I am reporting the news. I'm a member of the press because I post on social media. What about if I have a blog? What if I have a cool blog? Then I give it a title like The World Report. And I say, this is the World Report, and I'm Max Nosbisch, and I'm the journalist here, and I'm giving you guys the news. Does that make me a reporter? Does that make me the press? Do I have to get a paycheck? Does that make me a member of the press? Is it all about just who gets the paycheck? That seems a little arbitrary. So what about if I have a blog? What if I tell my friends? If I say, oh my God, guys, I just saw this crime happen right outside the Lewiston Public Library. It was crazy and blah, blah, blah. And I give you guys the news. Am I a reporter now? Do I have to be upheld to the highest levels of journalistic standards when I tell you guys what I saw when we hang out later that night? What about YouTube? A lot of people get their news from YouTube. A lot of companies like New York Times, Washington Post, these legacy media, they use things like YouTube. They'll post on YouTube. What about if I start a YouTube channel where I give my thoughts on the news? What if I'm even breaking stories in my community? I do an expose on all the corruption, here at the Lewiston Public Library. I sleuth in and I get hired and I volunteer, but really I'm just muckraking, trying to find where the corruption's at. And I put it on my YouTube channel. Now, am I now a member of the press? So do any of those count as the press? It's a good question. It's a good question. Again, we have 45 words to deal with. The founding fathers didn't add little asterisks and little things at the bottom that say, when we mean the press, we mean blah, 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 blah. When we mean freedom of speech, we meant blah, 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 blah. It probably would have been helpful if they added that, but they didn't. They probably intentionally left it vague for stuff like new technology. Oops. So the press, like I said, is a controversial. Freedom of the press is controversial. A lot of controversies around the freedom of the press. The death of local journalism is one. In fact, at the First Amendment Museum, we have a small exhibit on news deserts. News deserts are regions in the country that do not have local journalism. So obviously everywhere all over the United States, you can tune into CNN, Fox, MSNBC, CBS, all the things I just mentioned, but they may not have local journalism. They may know what's going on in Washington, D.C., but they may not know what's going on at the county level, at the city level, at the local level, regional level. And if you look at a map of news deserts, I should put one on here. If you look at a map of news deserts, there's more than you'd think. In fact, we're in a county that I think touches 3 counties that are considered news deserts just here in this county in Lewiston alone. So again, all sorts of social and societal ills have been attributed to the newsletter, the news desert phenomenon. Misinformation, and I believe I have disinformation. Well, all it takes is one letter to change the meaning of a word. What are those? What's the difference? Misinformation. Misinformation is what I did earlier. It's me putting Zoe Deschanel in the PowerPoint unintentionally. I unintentionally lied to you guys. I unintentionally gave you the wrong information. I didn't mean to. I just messed up the facts. It's similar to if I saw a crime, if I'm a reporter and the criminal is wearing a blue sweater and I remember it later on and I go, I think it was a green sweater. I'm not trying to lie to you. I'm just recalling the facts wrong. Disinformation is when I intentionally do it. When I say, oh, it was a green sweater guy to protect my friend here in the blue sweater. Wasn't him. It was this guy in the green sweater. That's when I intentionally lie to people. So that's the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Algorithms. This one's tough, and this one requires a little bit of explanation. So I don't know if you've ever been, you Google stuff, you get sick one day and you start Googling your symptoms, and then you start getting ads for medicine to treat whatever ailment you think you might have. How did that happen? Or you're talking to your friends about a certain product you want, and then you start getting ads online for those ads. It's because this algorithm is kicking in. They're keeping track of how you're interacting with the web, and they're feeding stuff that it knows you like. So let's take that into politics. If I start constantly clicking on things I agree with and I think is awesome and great and positive and wonderful, then the algorithm's going to start feeding me headlines and content that it knows I'm going to click on because I think it's wonderful and awesome and great. And then when an election happens that doesn't go my way, I'm confused. I'm like, what the heck? All the media I've been consuming said that X was going to win the election, and now Y has won. What the heck? It must be voter fraud. It must be something. It must be this. I don't know what's going on. Taking the opposite direction too. I'm only clicking on things that upset me. I'm getting in arguments on the comment section. I'm going on YouTube videos and I'm fighting people in the comment section. I'm getting on Facebook and I'm arguing with mom and dad and uncle and aunt and cousins all on Facebook about politics. I'm sharing articles that anger me, that get me mad. How can you guys believe this? And then the algorithm's gonna start taking note of that. I'm clicking on the stuff, I'm interacting with stuff, I'm spending hours a day on the comment section arguing with people. And it's gonna start sending me content that it knows gets me angry, gets me upset. So then I have the opposite problem. Now I think the world's a lot worse than it actually is. I'm terminally online now. And I'm constantly enraged by the state of the world, even though if I just went outside, unplugged, probably get a whole new perspective. So that's the danger of algorithms. The web is watching you. The internet is watching you. They're keeping track of what you're doing, and they're coming up with ways to keep you online through these algorithms. Big money in big media. There's a lot of money to be made in media. There's a lot of money to be made on you consuming media. And companies, whether they're large or small, are going to give content. They're going to provide content that gets people to tune in. We want to keep eyes on the screen. We want to keep eyes on the TV, eyes on the computer, eyes on the article. So we're going to give you stuff that it knows is dramatic, is crazy, wild, going to get you reading, Lobsterman ordered off how do you say that? Matanicus? Never heard of that part of Maine, but so again, it gets you fired up. And then media bias. I mean, this is elementary, right? We all know the media is biased, and it's their right to be biased. You can start a newspaper that's the most lefty or the most righty newspaper in the world, and that's your right to do that. There's no law that says the media has to be fair and objective and blah, blah, blah. There's probably wonderful journalistic standards that say these things, but there's no obligation to adhere to journalistic standards. So you can go as crazy as you want. And I think I have a little bit, another slide that shows sort of some media bias. So hopefully we'll get to see that. So here's a little activity I think is kind of elucidating and kind of drives a lot of this home. Try to identify the real and fake news in some of these headlines. So on one, it says area plows using Skittles to maintain roads instead of salt. The other one, it says Maryland man plows snow on motorized toilet. Both pretty goofy articles. Which one's true? Which one's false? Again, this is a fun thing to do when I have a class full of teenagers. They get really into this. So the Maryland man is true, and the using Skittles to maintain the roads is false. Look at this one, taking it a little more serious. The Lincoln Project immediately releases series of ads calling for Biden impeachment. Trump election campaign asks judge to declare him winner in Pennsylvania. So which one's the real, which one's the fake? The real is the Trump election campaign asks judge to declare him winner in Pennsylvania. The Lincoln Project one's fake, but I would forgive you if you thought the reverse. Or what about this one? Dramatic footage show divers underwater during the rescue of the Thai soccer team that was stranded in a flooded cave. Or Man survives 60 hours at bottom of Atlantic, rescued after finding air pocket in tugboat. They're both pretty crazy. Which one's real? Which one's fake? The man surviving 60 hours at the bottom of the Atlantic. That one's real. But the problem here is the Thai soccer team thing happened. That's a real news story. You might remember it. That the flooded cave, the whole thing, that all happened. But the footage in this article is completely fake. It's from something else. So that's the danger of fake news. This one's kind of a trick but that's the danger of fake news, right? Like it often describes real things that we know are happening, that we know exist, but it just fudges all the facts. It fudges it skews everything in a way to make it fake. So that's what makes, it's not always so absurd as the headline's just wrong. Oftentimes the headline, there's a kernel of truth. It just what that kernel turns into ends up being a lie. And then here's the other one, right? Who gets their news off social media? Again, we bring up this question of, is social media the press? And how do we interact with the news on social media, especially in the 21st century? This slide got a little messed up, but who do we trust and how do we decide that? This is a great question. Everyone has to ask themselves this question at some point when they're dealing with the press. Who do we decide who to trust? And I ask that because here's my media bias chart. What sources are we trusting and why? This is kind of a little confusing, but if you look at the bottom, it has a spectrum of left to right. So basically liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, however you want to do that spectrum. And then on the other bar, I guess that goes the Y axis. Yeah. You'll see fact reporting all the way down to contains inaccurate or fabricated info. So it looks like on the right, the biggest liars are before it's news, which I've never heard of. But if you're getting your news from before it's news, maybe you ask yourself why. On the left, looks like our most egregious person is, I'm having a hard time seeing it. Let me read it. Is the Jimmy Dore show. So maybe if you're getting your news from Jimmy Dore or the before it's news, that's from the left is Jimmy Dore, sorry. A lot of fake news, but in the middle, you'll see a lot of our legacy media, the so-called legacy media. You'll see Wall Street Journal slightly to the right up there, NBC slightly to the left, New York Times is left, CNN is left, Fox is right. And then you'll see various things. Breitbart's over there on the right. The Root is over there on the left. And so why do you trust these people? Why are they conforming to your biases or do you hate them? So why, again, asking yourself why. And there's two cases that I think are really important to understanding a lot of the confusion around freedom of the press these days, or kind of clarifying how the press runs. And the first one is New York Times v. Sullivan. So Martin Luther King Jr. was imprisoned in Montgomery, Alabama. And the New York Times wrote an article scathing the city of Montgomery and many of the city departments for locking up Martin Luther King Jr. and just their treatment of the civil rights movement in general. Now, unfortunately, in the New York Times article, it's right there, it says, heed their rising voices. They got a lot of the facts wrong. They got a lot of the information wrong. And so the city commissioner in Montgomery, his name was L.B. Sullivan, he sued the New York Times. He said, you guys are liars. This is libel. You guys are libeling me right now because you guys got the facts wrong in this article. And so the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the New York Times. The Supreme Court said, hey, the press has a role to play. They're the fourth estate. They're the watchdog on our democracy. They have a crucial role to play. And every time the press gets something wrong, every time the press fudges something, every time the press messes up, we can't sue them into oblivion. We wouldn't have a free press if every time the press got something wrong, they open themselves up for lawsuits. So forget about it. That's a standard that is still upheld today. You can essentially print anything you want, and it's very hard to prove libel and slander as a member of the press. Same with another interesting case is from 1988, this Hustler magazine versus Falwell. Hustler magazine is an adult magazine that was founded and owned by a man named Larry Flynt. Larry Flynt was a very colorful advocate of the First Amendment, a very colorful defender of free speech. He's probably one of the few people that took a bullet for the First Amendment and survived. Got shot outside a Georgia courthouse after publishing a magazine and going to court to defend it against obscenity charges. So in his magazine, Larry Flint and the Hustler team put together this ad for what's that? Campari. It's a sort of alcohol. They put this ad together, and in the ad they make fun of Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell is or was, I can't remember if he's alive or not. He was a right-wing evangelical Christian who was very controversial, lightning rod of controversy. And in the ad here in Hustler magazine, they imply all sorts of nasty and disgusting things about Jerry Falwell that are not true. Some very absurd, like very gross things about Jerry Falwell that are not true. So Jerry Falwell sues Hustler magazine, and he says, you guys libeled me. You guys, this is not funny. This is not true. You're publishing fake information about me. And when the Supreme Court sided with Hustler magazine, Supreme Court said, look, this is satire. This is funny. This is meant to be humorous. It's meant to be exaggerating in a comical way. And so every time someone publishes satire, we can't have opened themselves up to lawsuit. You know, the whole art of the political cartoon, Stephen Colbert, who else does political comedy? All those people would, you wouldn't have political comedy anymore. Social commentary through comedy if you open that up. So the Supreme Court sided with Hustler magazine against Jerry Falwell. And I say all this in the wake of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, which was like actually like Johnny Depp did manage to prove libel and slander against Amber Heard. But I just want to emphasize how rare that actually is. Usually it does not happen. Usually it's a very, very high threshold to prove libel and slander. It's very hard to do. So it's kind of amazing that Johnny Depp did that. I have to include that now because that was a time where it was proven, but usually it's not, especially if it's against a political figure or some sort of person who, I guess, dips their fingers in the realm of politics. So freedom of assembly, this will be a little quicker, but taking it to the online sphere, what is freedom of assembly? What does freedom of assembly protect? Protects your right to join a union, to start a union. Protects your right to join a political party, start a political party. Joins your right to join one of those clubs you see when you drive into a town, the Kiwanis, the Freemasons, the Lions, the Elks, the Woodmen of America. I don't know if that's still around, but all those clubs, even at school, they have like little versions. Meet with your friends and hang out in a public space. Do that. Go to church, have a ceremony, religious ceremony. Go to a parade, have a parade or a march. Go to a concert, Go to something like the fair. Congregate at a fair. This is the Bangor State Fair, but I like the Freiburg Fair more. Go to the movies, have a movie, especially a movie in the park. Maybe freedom of assembly. It protects your right to start a movie theater, I guess is a more accurate way of doing it. Get coffee with your friends, go get drinks. Maybe not take the drink out with you in the public street. That's against the law in some places. But if you go to New Orleans, Savannah, Georgia, you can take your drink out in the street. It's freedom of assembly to do that. Go to a protest, especially in a park, outside a government building. What about online? Are we assembling right now? Because I'm on Zoom and I'm on Facebook. Is that freedom of assembly right now? We're moving. What about a comment section? Is that a group of people assembling? That's a whole interesting conversation. Again, thinking about it in this online internet sphere as it gets a little more complicated. And again, I mentioned earlier, this is the only one with a bit of a caveat, the right of the people peaceably to assemble. Well, what defines peaceably? What if we're having a protest that is too loud? Say it's 1 a.m. and we get all the permits. We're secure. We're on public property, but we have our blowhorns and our or whatever those. I have my microphone and I'm screaming and yelling and hooting and hollering, and playing music, and people can't sleep and they have to work the next day. Is that violence now? Is that not peaceably? Is that a breach of the peace? What if we're blocking traffic on a public road? Is that peaceable? Nobody's getting hurt. What about if an ambulance needs to go by? Is that no longer peaceable? Where's the line? What if we're destroying property but not hurting anybody? No one is physically getting hurt. We're just breaking objects that have no feelings. Is that peaceable? What if it's too distasteful? And there's a great example of this is Westboro Baptist Church. You might remember them from like 10 years ago. The Westboro Baptist Church was a group of, extremely right-wing Christians, and they had a real problem with the advance in LGBTQ plus rights here in the United States. And so they decided that they would go protest the funerals of LGBTQ soldiers who got killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so this was a controversy, right? I mean, you probably remember hearing about this. And it actually went to the Supreme Court if they had a right to do this. And the Supreme Court said, yes, it's their First Amendment right to protest the funeral of dead soldiers. This was probably one of the most unpopular Supreme Court decisions in American history. I think it enraged both members of the far right, and everyone in between. But again, there's a price we pay for all these freedoms. There's things we have to put up with to have these freedoms. Again, the price we pay. So that's sort of the end. I kind of skipped over freedom of petition and freedom of religion. I didn't think we'd have enough time to get into those two. But I'm open to questions about those two. And I'm open to questions about anything that I've talked about already, or anything that I haven't covered. I know we've barely touched the surface of the First Amendment. There's so much we could talk about. A lot of these topics could have a whole course, a whole class unto themselves just to cover one of these topics. So anybody have any questions? I'd be more than happy to answer any questions, whether it's online or in person.
So there is a question online. Any thoughts on how the FCC fairness doctrine played into the freedom of the press during the time it was in effect?
Yeah, the fairness doctrine, a lot of people will wax poetic about the fairness doctrine and what a great thing it was. And I think it was, my personal opinion is that it was a pretty decent thing. So if you're not familiar with what the fairness doctrine was, when radio and TV came out, really the major way to broadcast over radio and TV was over a lot of government-owned equipment. So government-owned radio stations, government-owned satellites, however you broadcasted was a lot of times owned by the government. And the government basically said that, you know, if we own the equipment, then we have the right to sort of censor, restrict, be selective about the content that we put. And so they implemented this thing called the fairness doctrine, where if you were going to broadcast the news over a government equipment, you had to meet this fairness doctrine, which was essentially doing your best to show both sides of an issue. And you sort of had this glory period that people really remember fondly of, you know, like the Walter Cronkites of the world, the 1950s and 1960s news, really doing their best to make things as fair and balanced, I guess, for lack of a better term, as possible, and show both sides with varying degrees of success. But 1980s is part of this larger movement to deregulate a lot of industries. They got rid of the fairness doctrine, and it's opened a lot of people argue it's opened this can of worms for more partisanship, more divisive rhetoric, less fairness. Today, I think it would be incredibly hard to enforce something like the fairness doctrine, given how decentralized things have become. I mean, who watches cable anymore? Everybody streams now, and they don't rely on government equipment to do that. HBO, the reason they can get away with showing all the nudity and inappropriate stuff and these words that you can't say on cable is because they own their own satellites. And if you own podcasts, if you own Spotify, if you own YouTube, if you own all these questions that I don't even know if bringing back the fairness doctrine would really do much anymore, just from how decentralized things have become and how privatized a lot of how we communicate has become. So I hope that answers your question. It's a good question. I love talking about the fairness doctrine. It's a really interesting thing. And I think it's why a lot of people, especially older folks, remember like a more, I guess, fair media environment, or a more sensible media environment, maybe.
There is a question about what about bullying on social media? How does that play into this?
Yeah, bullying on social media. So one thing I will say is that there are certain classes of people who do not have full First Amendment protections. And you may be happy to hear that one of that class of people is people under the age of 18 and students in public schools. So other groups would include members of the military, prisoners, incarcerated people, public employees. So when we talk about bullying online, usually we mean in the context of like a public school. So those students can get in trouble for things they say off campus or on campus if it disrupts class time. So we recently had a Supreme Court case in 2021 involving a Snapchat cheerleader. And I call her a Snapchat cheerleader because that's what everyone knows her by. She was a cheerleader in Pennsylvania who got cut from her cheerleading team. So she went on social media. She said, F school, F everything, F everyone, something like that, except she said the 4-letter word. And when she got to school the next day, she got in trouble. She said, hold on, I was off campus on a private platform, not disrupting class time, and talking to someone not related to the school. So how the heck can you get me in trouble? Went to the Supreme Court, and in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court sided with the student and said, yeah, that's true. You can't get her in trouble. She wasn't disrupting class time. But if I go, hey, Billy, in gym class tomorrow, I'm going to beat you up, that's probably going to disrupt Billy's learning and Billy's class time. So then I can probably get in trouble for it. It's like if I make a bomb threat against the school, it's not my freedom of speech to do that because I'm disrupting class time in the most dramatic and egregious and awful way. So same with bullying. If it's not disrupting class time, it's probably going to be really hard to like make a First Amendment code around. But if it is targeting someone in the school, that's going to make that person have a harder time learning or make them feel unsafe, then you can probably restrict their speech because, like I said, students don't have full access to their First Amendment freedoms anyway. I hope that makes sense. But again, if I'm just bullying random online strangers, as long as I'm not violating my terms of service for whatever site I'm on, you'll notice this. There's sites like 4chan and Reddit and YouTube where like they have a total lax free speech like environment. And you'll see a lot more like hate speech and bigotry and bullying and threats and stuff like that. But if you go to more curated space like Facebook and Twitter, which it might be even crazy to hear that those are like more curated spaces than a lot of corners of the internet. Yeah, it's probably a lot easier for me to get banned off those platforms for violating the terms of service than in some of the other ones.
Any comments on the effects of freedom of speech being extended to corporations, donations, or other non-traditional things that are sometimes included in the speech umbrella?
Yeah. Wow. So why am I blanking so hard on the name of this very famous Supreme Court case that we're clearly talking about? God, I'm just drawing a blank on the name of that case from 2012. Was it the Pacific? Anybody? It's the Hillary Clinton documentary. It'll come to me. But so essentially the Supreme Court case from 2012, like I said, I'm blanking on the name, that formal name. The Supreme Court ruled that campaign donations are a form and big money in political campaigns are a form of speech. And what they really argued was that money enables speech and that you need money to do things like print flyers and publish things and buy airtime, and therefore it's a protected form of speech because it enables all these things that we communicate. But obviously that is a controversial thing. And again, this is Citizens United. That's the name I'm thinking of. Citizens United is a Supreme Court case. And and in terms of controversial Supreme Court cases, that's one of the most controversial. And all sorts of political and social and societal ills and troubles have been blamed on Citizens United. It has very few defenders, but a lot of the really staunch First Amendment people you will meet are some of the biggest defenders of Citizens United. A lot of the people who like really study the First Amendment are the people who really love Citizens United, but like the average person probably hates Citizens United. And it's if you try to read the case, like the details of it, it's actually really hard to follow and really complicated compared to a lot of cases. I think its critics would say that it's had a very negative effect on our political landscape and our political environment. And it's given a lot of power to the wealthy and given a lot of power to people who have the money to spend. And this issue of dark money and super PACs affecting the buying elections, And then I think it's very few supporters, again, would say that, well, money enables a lot of speech and we want to have more speech, not less. So more money, more speech, more good, I guess. Yeah, it's a tough one. Depending on which side of the aisle you fall on that issue, you're going to have a different opinion on Citizens United. It's also, all sorts of conspiracy theories have come from Citizens United. So I would say it's pretty like 90% of people don't like it, but the 10% that do are usually like your First Amendment hardcore crowd.
Do you believe the government has a role in educating issues with the advance of technology that results in difficulties determining reality or real from fake videos?
Educating, I think, is that
Educating.
educating. I'm not familiar
So
with that.
passing judgment.
So does the government play a role in passing judgment on
Dealing with issues like advancing technology from, that results from the difficulty in determining like real from fake videos, like that
Okay.
example that you showed us? Like, does the government or should the government have any
Yeah.
role in that?
I think I understand the question. So I don't know if anybody remembers this from a couple of weeks or even months ago at this point, but Joe Biden's cabinet administration, I guess, tried to start a misinformation board that was going to crack down supposedly on misinformation or misinformation and disinformation. And this was like, got really attacked from a lot of people, especially, I mean, the obvious crowd attack, like Joe Biden's political opponents obviously attacked this. I mean, this was like a slam dunk, low hanging fruit. It doesn't get much more Orwellian or conjure up like images of 1984 than having like a misinformation or disinformation board. I mean, we're almost culturally conditioned to hear that and go, no, we don't want that here in the United States. So Joe Biden made efforts to do that. Didn't go over well. It's permanently suspended now. I don't think it's actually formally been like ceased, but it's just like on permanent hold, probably never to return. And so I think that's, whether you think that's scary or not, I think it's an acknowledgement from the government that that this is enough of a problem that the government does see themselves as trying, like, we need to do something about this. And I think a lot of the concern from Joe Biden and his administration came from foreign actors who are making misinformation, disinformation, specifically Russia and China is what they were concerned about. And obviously Russian Chinese citizens fall outside the purview of the First Amendment. So you can shut them down all you want, right? There's one other, like these deep fakes and stuff. There was one other comment I had about that. From the government. There's another. Oh yeah, and then so Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, he's indicated that the court's going to have to step up and start overturning a lot of these cases, including New York Times v. Sullivan. That maybe it's time to relook at something like New York Times v. Sullivan, which was ruled in the 60s without the internet. Now that we have the internet, I mean, this misinformation, this disinformation, this libel and slander, these threats, they've all gotten so out of hand that maybe it's time for the court to relook at a lot of these old laws and maybe decide them differently. So you see, I hope those are two examples from two sides of the political spectrum on people commenting that the government should play a more active role in, taking down a lot of this misinformation, disinformation. I think misinformation, disinformation is a big hot topic. How do we deal with it while preserving our First Amendment freedoms? That's like the essential question. And if you know the answer to that question in an effective way, then write your book and collect your multi-million dollars and go on your speaking tour, because this is a tough question that doesn't have a lot of good answers. Cool. Well, thank you guys for all your questions. Thank you for tuning in and showing up. I appreciate that. I'll show this last slide here. Like I said, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, so we rely on donations. Look us up online. You'll see our link there. Leave us a good review if you enjoyed today's talk. TripAdvisor, Google Reviews, Facebook. That all helps get our word out there. Bumps us up on the algorithm. People are looking for stuff to do in Augusta. Well, like I said, we're open Monday through Saturday from 10 to 4 p.m. in the summer, and Monday through Friday, 10 to 4 in the winter. We're at 184 State Street, right next to the Blaine House in Augusta. You can see our social media there. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Come by and say hello. Come for a chat, all that good stuff. And again, thank you guys so much.
All right, we're going to go ahead and stop the stream and the Zoom meeting as well. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. It was awesome to have you. And thank you so much, Max, for your presentation. Have a good night, everyone.